Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hi, I'm Tristan. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. This show is brought to you by my company, Motion. We are a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. Podcasts are great for external audiences like prospects and customers, but some organizations are using them for internal communications too. Recently, I appeared as a guest on the Internal Marketing Podcast hosted by Kerry-Ann Betton Stimpson. And we had a conversation about my experiences with supporting our customers' internal podcasts. During the interview, I covered three big reasons why we've seen internal podcasts work. The first one is transparency. An internal podcast gives your employees a window into the thoughts of your company's leadership. With remote and hybrid remote work more common now, an internal podcast allows execs to share company updates in really a very informal way. Transparency can be a core value of your company, but it's only true if your leadership follows through. The second is consistency. When I worked at large organizations, I was a consultant for several Fortune 500 companies. Consistent internal communication was always a problem for me. Sometimes I received an email newsletter, sometimes I got a link to watch a video, but with an internal podcast, we're seeing companies be more consistent with how they share ideas internally. And the third reason we're seeing internal podcasts work is because they're a flexible format. For over a decade, I produced corporate videos for nonprofits, government agencies, and tech companies. One of the main reasons companies hired us was to produce videos featuring fireside chats or executive updates. This largely involved a 4-person production crew, a makeup artist, set design, and post-production took weeks because it required layers of approvals. With an internal podcast, the process is much more efficient. Podcasts can be recorded in audio only or audio and video formats, and it can be recorded more informally without a large production crew. We are still in the early stages of internal or private podcasts, but I'm seeing early signs of it working for a lot of companies. So with that said, here's the conversation I had with Kerry-Ann Betton Stimpson on the Internal Marketing Podcast.
It's going to be an interesting discussion because I actually was sharing with you, before we hit the record button, that a lot of companies I find are tuning into the idea of doing internal podcasts, right? So as companies are looking at creative ways to engage their employees in everything that's happening about the company, things like the traditional newsletter, those still very valuable. I don't want to step on any toes here,
Right.
but they find that, folks need different and ingenious ways to engage their team members. And podcasts already are popular media mode of communication that a lot of people consume just in your regular day-to-day lives. And a lot of companies are now recognizing, hey, podcasting is something that we could take on internally, not too difficult to do, but certainly could enjoy greater engagement. I know in my own experience in the company that I work for, when we're doing our own internal marketing and internal communication efforts, we've found podcasts to drive a deeper level of engagement, even more so than the traditional e-newsletter. So when I thought about one of the topics that I wanted to cover for this season, internal marketing podcast, I said, hey, let's cover how internal podcasts can help to drive and support the whole internal marketing podcast. And of course, I thought of you because, hey, podcasting is your line of business, right?
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining me. And, I just wanted to start off, as I always do, Tristan, with a level setting question. And really, when we talk about podcasting, we know what regular podcasts are. What, in your experience, is the difference between an internal podcast and a regular podcast, like what we hear about, on the various podcasting platforms and directories?
Yeah. So from an internal podcasting perspective, I like to think about it as, your company's podcast like a normal podcast is really for external audiences. Typically, it's produced more so by the marketing team, and that's to get your message out into the marketplace and to connect with thought leaders and that sort of thing. Whereas an internal podcast, really the audience switches to a focus with your internal employees. And a lot of times almost equate an internal podcast with a private podcast, which is even like it's a different technical component to it. And I'm anxious to hear how you all handle your internal podcast, but I actually did a whole series. This was about 9 months ago. We did a series on our podcast, recorded content, where I brought on Mark Asquith, the owner of Supercast, as well as the owner of gosh, what was the other one? Castos. So we did like a 3-part series of private podcasting and tried to get an understanding of all the technical components of that. But essentially, the private podcast is just a way for you to distribute a podcast with a more private setting to where, the general public can't get this and consume the content from a regular RSS feed. So you're kind of protecting some of that information somewhat, and then you're able to more freely discuss some of your internal, company messages and some of the experiences that employees are having.
Great to identify the distinction. And that being said, then, Tristan, do you find more companies are catching on and rolling out their own private or internal podcasts, as it were? What are the trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, the whole reason that we did that series last year was because we were getting a lot of requirements, either with early prospects or even in the sales process, where they're like, we know that we want to do a podcast for external audiences and for our marketing engine, but this communication style is so effective. How can we then translate that into more of an internal component? And that's why we started to explore it ourselves. And when I had Craig Hewitt on, the owner of Castos, when I had him on the podcast, he even mentioned at that time, like, private podcasting is just very new. We're in the very early stages of it. And even from a technical side of things, they're still trying to figure out how it works, because as you know, you probably listen to a lot of podcasts yourself. I mean, there's so many different apps that you can use. There's so many different platforms out there where you can consume the same content that comes from an RSS feed. So that presents a lot of challenges on the technical side to ensure that you protect that information, and that it's only the certain folks that you want to listen to that content, that they're accessing the content, on the other end. So, it's the actual meat and potatoes that are in the episodes themselves, but then it's how does that get distributed, and why is it different than just a regular public RSS feed?
Yeah, and it's still early days, and I get that, and clearly a lot of companies are curious and looking into it and rolling out their own. Can you give any sort of sense based on the conversations you've been having, why more companies are kind of jumping on the bandwagon, as it were, albeit slowly but surely?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that come to mind. First and foremost, that I think, we've been talking about it for a few years, but the pandemic did change the way that people are working these days. We have remote work is just really a common scenario for most organizations, and people are trying to determine how to increase engagement with employees, how to build relationships, how to just really connect with their employees on a human level. And a podcast really provides that capability. I mean, if you think about a podcast just with an external audience, it's really less about a one to many relationship. You're in someone's ear, and it's that really one-to-one connection. You're allowing your audience to come in as a fly on the wall. And so if you think about that concept and how useful that would be for a company, it really opens your eyes quite a bit. If you think about your company's leadership and getting their mission out there, and getting buy-in from employees and how important that is, an internal podcast is a great way to do that, because you have really that intimate connection to the company's leadership. And I don't really think there's any other kind of medium that equates to an internal podcast in that way. And I'm just starting to remember the conversation we had, Kerry-Ann, when you were on my podcast, and you said first and foremost, one of the most important things is just the ability for a company to articulate its mission and vision.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is something that is not done one time. It's not something that you put on a poster and you hang up. on the wall.
That's
It's
right.
something that you have to live and breathe. And so in order to do that, I think you need some communication channel that is consistent, and you're constantly supporting that mission and that vision, and that consistency is really how you get buy-in along the way. But I mean, how do you feel about that?
I'm in total agreement with it. As I was sharing with you, we had been following some of the more traditional ways of communicating to our team members for many, 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 many years. Email and e-newsletters being the top mode, and I mean, I get that because, especially because we are what we call a regional organization, and when we say regional, we're in the Caribbean, we're in Jamaica, we're in the Dominican Republic, we're in Trinidad and Tobago. So when you have that kind of physical distance, then you're going to have to rely on digital channels to communicate, and email and e-newsletters are the easiest triggers to pull, right? But when we started to look at the numbers, open rates, read rates, they weren't where we had wanted them to be. And when we started to ask the questions and talk to people and say, hey, what are some of the ways in which you want to be sensitized? And
Mhm.
we recognize that, especially given the millennial and Gen Z generations of employees that started to dominate the total number of employees that we had on board, they prefer to digest content in what I call a multimedia kind of a way. They love
Yeah.
video, they love audio. So just sending an e-newsletter was no longer sufficient for us to do what it is we wanted to do. And so it led to the concept of a video podcast. And it's been so much more well received and certainly well digested. And it's something that has been a very, very good experience for us. I mean, just based on everything you would have shared so far, Tristan, if there's anyone who's listening who's kind of thinking, you know, this sounds like something we should be exploring, could you give us probably two reasons why you think companies should consider implementing their own private or internal podcasts?
Yeah, I was trying to think. I saw that question earlier, and I was
Yeah.
like, "Is there only 2 things I can identify?"
Well, hey, go for more than two.
Go
I
for
was
more.
just trying to be kind, but if you got
Yeah.
three and four, we'll take them.
Let's see. Well, the first one that comes to mind is just transparency. And we touched on that a second ago, where I think it's very difficult. Actually, let me just go back to my scenario where I was working at IBM and Oracle. So I worked for these big, huge software companies, and I just I'll say strongly disliked the all hands meetings that they would set up, and you would bring in like sometimes 300, 400 people. I mean, we even rented a movie theater one time. So everyone had to drop what they were doing. You had to bring the whole project team over. There's 500 people in a movie theater,
Wow.
and the context switching, just to make that happen, you have to drop what you're doing. You have to drive 5 minutes, to the place. You go in, you sit down. It takes 10 minutes to get started. I mean, it's an hour and a half time, just to get this all hands meeting in place. And it just doesn't feel personal. It doesn't feel intimate. It doesn't feel like I have a direct line of communication to that leadership. And it just
Yeah.
felt disconnected. And
Mhm.
and I think one of the big reasons, probably the most important thing, is just that transparency piece that a lot of companies state that that's a goal. They wanna be more transparent with their employees. They wanna be able to share information, progress, and where we're going, and that mission and vision. But if you're not, if you don't have, like, that communication platform, and it's an intimate, communication line, I don't think it resonates as well. And so if you have an internal podcast, you can have your company's leadership, and whether that's the CEO or some other, different C-suite executives that want to share certain things with their group, you have this ability to just talk in front of a camera, or even an audio only
Mhm.
podcast where you might be talking into your phone, and you're able to share things in a more informal way. And I think that just translates into a more authentic dialogue that you're able to have with your employees. And if you just think about how a podcast is consumed, it's me as a leader in a podcast format, and then on the other side, it's just one person, and you're
Yeah.
you're in the headphones, and it's just a different dynamic than me sitting in a movie theater with 499 of my
Yeah.
other colleagues. half paying attention and half worrying about the emails that are piling up back at the
Yeah.
office that I'm going to have to deal with.
Tell me about
So
it.
I think that's probably the biggest thing is just
Mhm.
transparency and that
Transparency.
communication line that you establish. And then the other big component, and we talked about this with external podcasts when you and I spoke on my show, is a podcast is just a way to communicate consistently. And I think with an internal show, you can be a little bit more informal. It doesn't have to be as branded or what have you, because it already has that natural, it's encapsulated in your brand already. It's distributed internally. So that's already a given. And so you can have more of an informal dialogue. And
Mm.
and that's something that allows you to be more consistent with, because there's not so much production involved, and
Yeah.
you can kind of record something, clean it up a little bit, and then give it to your internal comms team, and then they're off and running. And I think that's really the great piece about it is a big hurdle or obstacle for teams when they're producing content consistently is that it's too cumbersome, and there's too much involved. There's too many pieces moving around. And so it drops down the priority list. And then as soon as you miss 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, it's just easy to say, "Oh, the hell with it, and we're just not gonna do it anymore." And then you fall back into something else where, you're pulling people into a movie theater just to say that you did an all hands meeting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those are 2 big things, and now here's the third one. So I
Okay,
said I had
sure.
more than 2. The third one is, as you mentioned, you all were distributing a newsletter in a written format. The nice thing about a podcast, and if you do a video podcast internally, you can then produce audio, video, and written material from that one, piece of content that your executive creates. So if you think about the efficiency that's rolled
Mm.
into that process,
Yeah.
you have your CEO spends 30 minutes in front of a camera, and you're able to produce all this material that people then can then consume on the other side in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
And for some people, a newsletter might be their most favorite way to consume information.
Mhm.
But then on the other hand, maybe it is that podcast that they wanna listen to while they're walking the dog or driving in the car. And if you produce that show up front in a video podcast format, you have the ability, you have the flexibility to produce those different types of, content formats downstream.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just thinking about that. The repurposing possibilities are endless. Because even if you are doing it as as an audio or video podcast, you can get that transcription and convert it into an e-newsletter blog type, bit of communication that you could send out to your team. So awesome, awesome possibilities. Tristan, so if we're talking to folks right now and they're listening and they're like, "Oh, my brain is ticking. This sounds great. Awesome ideas, and I want to look at implementing an internal private podcast for my company as part of my own internal marketing, internal comms efforts." You've produced hundreds of podcasts, thousands of podcasts, even over the course of your career. I'm sure it's not much different. What's the advice that you would share with anyone right now as far as giving them some kind of guidance on what are the things they should be doing as a foundation setting exercise or set of exercises to set up their podcast for success?
Yeah, the biggest thing is the strategy piece.
Mm,
A lot of folks come to us even, when they're in the sales cycle, they're trying to figure out, how do we get this show off the ground, whether that's an internal podcast or even on the external side for marketing purposes. And they're asking questions about microphones and headphones and video or audio. And I think it all rolls back to answering 2 key questions for your show, whether that's an external or an internal podcast. It is, who's the show for? Like, specifically, can you define who the show is for? And then how does the show help? Those are really the 2 most important things to answer with any podcast that you're creating for your business.
mm,
Now, this doesn't necessarily apply if you're a creator and you're producing something for fun and it's a hobby. We're working with companies that are producing branded shows. So you you really have to boil it down to those 2 different things. And if you can clearly identify that up front, that really serves as your foundation for everything that you create from that standpoint. And the one thing that we do, and that I really feel like is important. We create what we call a theme statement. And that is
Okay.
where that theme statement clearly identifies who the podcast is for and how it helps. And in the case of an internal podcast, who it's for, it's your employees for sure. And it might be everyone that works for the company. And that might be good enough. Or, you might be producing a show for the sales team, which is a scenario that we're involved in, where it's a subset of your employees and you're sharing for a different purpose. But you have to define what that is. And then secondly, how does it help? And the reason we phrase it that way is because really the best content marketing or the best content helps someone in some shape or form. And that could be inspiration or that could
Yeah.
be education. There's just a lot of different ways to do that. But that's really where everything starts, from my opinion, is that foundation, answering those two questions and establishing that strategy. And then, really everything else falls in line from there.
Awesome. And it's interesting that it all comes down to some of the basic fundamentals when you're talking about marketing and communications. It's understanding your audience, what their needs are, and how is it that your piece of content is going to be helping them or adding value to their lives. Because let's face it, if it's not going to add value, they're not going to listen.
Yeah.
And if you want folks to tune into your podcast, especially if it's a new one and people aren't quite sure where this all fits, it's great to level set up front and help them to identify just exactly how valuable it is. So great. So I've set up my strategy. I know who my podcast is for, how it's going to help them, what the message or key messages are going to be. In terms of the actual setup, what are some of the tools that a company should think of pulling together to actually know put the nuts and bolts together to set up the podcast?
So once you have your theme statement in place, you have to identify what we call your guides, and that involves like your host or guests or what have you. But these are the folks that are going to take your audience on a journey. And in some ways, the guide is the same host every time. And that host brings on guests and use an interview type format to go on a journey with your audience. And then in other situations, you might have a live event component that you're folding in there. You might have a roundtable discussion that's distributed internally where you have maybe 3 to 4 people in one session and you're trying to share that conversation. So I think, everything you have to figure out your structure and your format from there. So once you understand your theme statement, it's like basically how are we going to then execute that? How are we going to roll these to an episode that is something we're able to produce consistently? And then once you have that in place, you start to figure out, who are the other players involved? Are we going to bring in those guests? Are we going to bring in employees to support some of this information? Is it only going to be a solo format where it might be just our leadership talking on camera and having that intimate one-on-one discussion? So you have those conversations. And then from there, you start to figure out, what does it look like? What does it sound like? How is it structured? So is this like a 15-minute piece that you produce every week, that hits on those goals from your theme statement? Or
Yeah.
is it something a little bit more involved where, you might be doing a 30-minute piece where you are bringing on that guest and diving into more of a story structure from there. So there are a lot of different things that you can do, but they all roll back to that theme statement. So those are some things on the functional side. Then on the technical side, you do have to figure out, how are we going to execute this, using equipment and what are the
Yeah.
platforms that are in place. And the people that are involved, you want to set them up for success as best you can.
Mhm.
And we really just say, get some headphones, get a microphone, and then a camera. And I mean, you can really have a pretty good setup for $200-300.
Mhm.
And if we're talking about an internal podcast that is very important to your employees, and this is coming from leadership, it's a small price to pay. So once you have those things in place, you have to then think about your platform that you're going to use for recording.
Mm.
And I've dealt with a lot of folks, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies to startup CEOs. They're busy. They want this thing to be as easy as possible to execute. So
Yeah.
try to have a platform like Squadcast or Riverside that allows them to use their browser,
Mhm.
record directly with a webcam or a phone or another camera that's easy to set up, allows them to use a USB microphone, and
Mhm.
all these, pieces of technology and equipment work together. Then you're
Mhm.
able to record quickly and then hand that off to a team to post produce. And and put together pretty easily.
Yeah.
So I think those are the key components. And Kerry-Ann, just one thing to kind of juxtapose that scenario with some of the experience I had owning a video agency. I think an internal podcast is so much better because I mean, I just go back to some of the scenarios where I was working on a project with a large tech company in DC. We were hired to produce their internal videos every quarter, and they would bring in a 6-person crew. All right. So we have to set up a time to bring in 6 people, film with 2 cameras. It would take 2 to 3 weeks to produce. They would edit it, you know, tightly so that it's like a 3-minute piece. It just felt so like um inauthentic. It was just
Yeah.
so produced and it just didn't feel right. And we would do that
Mm-hmm.
every quarter. And I just, turn the table to now. And if you are able to produce a more intimate internal podcast and use a setup, at any time you're comfortable as a leader to produce, it just once again removes that friction on the production side to where you're kind of free to produce this content more consistently. And that's really where you start to see those benefits is when you do this over a period of time.
Absolutely. Um, just a quick question. I'm not sure if you can say, but when you talk about you getting your equipment together using a nice user-friendly platform to record and such, do you have to go through the whole rigmarole of, and I'm thinking not, but I'm just asking the clarifying question, if a lot of these podcast directories, they're really just for public podcasts, I'm thinking, right? They don't, do any of them have a component where they can host, I guess, private, if not host, but certainly house a private podcast that's accessible only to a particular user group, or you just kind of have to do that on your own intranet, I'm thinking. Can you say?
Yes. Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think that's really what drives the internal podcast is that private piece, which is a
Hmm.
technical requirement. And I think there are a couple of hosting platforms that I would point to for folks.
Okay.
Castos is one that we're familiar with, and we
Hmm.
have folks that are using that.
Yeah.
And they basically provide the ability to use your podcast apps that you're familiar with,
Hmm.
but you basically provide a username and password, and you have like this custom RSS feed that's not viewable in
Mm.
public directories.
Okay.
Another example is Supercast, and they even go to another level of detail where every single subscriber, and that could be an employee internally, every single subscriber gets their own unique RSS feed, which then gives you the ability to actually determine who is listening to what. And you can even customize that feed. So like if you go out and test Supercast and you sign up for their private podcast with your email, and you pull up that feed on your phone in a podcast app, it'll actually say like, "Hello, Tristan, here's your first episode." And it'll actually, using variables, you can customize that experience on their side. So
Okay.
that's some of the advantages there. And we're seeing companies that they're able to use that technology to protect the information that they have, on the internal side in a more secure way. And then we do have folks that are producing a podcast. It's meant for internal purposes, but it is publicly available. They don't
Okay.
really care. They're sharing stories, and their goal is mostly for their internal audience. But
Hmm.
it's no harm if it's shared outside. So I think just making that distinction is important as a company. Determining how sensitive that information is that you're sharing is probably a decision point there as to
Yeah.
whether you use one of these hosts or not.
Yeah, yeah, love that. Thanks so much for I mean, these are great, great nuggets. And I guess to kind of round out the cheat sheet, again, you've had tons of experience, and I know folks going in, it's very important to know what are the nuts and bolts, the tools that we're going to need to set ourselves up for success. Uh, I guess having gone through the learning cycle yourself with yourself, your clients, what would you say are some of the production and distribution, perhaps pitfalls that I would need to kind of be aware of so that I can avoid them if I can? Before I wade into the podcasting waters, what are some of the things that I'd need to remember so that I don't fall in the same loopholes, I guess, or have experienced the same pitfalls that others would have experienced in their own podcasting journey.
Yeah, the main thing when we think about distribution, it's important to go all the way back to the beginning. And one of the things we like to say a lot is that podcasts are more than an audio channel. And unfortunately, I think people still view a podcast as this thing that's an MP3 file that you put out on Buzzsprout or Castos and you can listen to on Spotify. But if you think about a podcast differently, especially as a company, it's really content that starts in a conversational format, and then you're able to reshape it in all these different ways. So if you think about distribution, it's not how can I get this audio file, to my employees. It's back to a point that you were making, Carrie Ann, where if you distribute this internally, you can put a video snippet on your internal, your company portal or whatever, channels you have internally to share information. Even if it's Slack, you can embed a video in a Slack channel. And that can be a nice little piece that comes from a longer form podcast that was shared. And you can link out to the internal episode and say, hey, here's Mr. or Mrs. CEO speaking 10 minutes on, the new health plans that are rolling out, and here's why we adjusted those. Here's a 2-minute overview, but click here to get the full episode where you can understand how this impacts you and your family, something like that. And so distribution, I think people get it wrong up front because they're just thinking about this channel. It's
Mm,
really just this thing that I want to check a box on and say that I have a podcast, but it's really about the communication piece, which goes back to really why we're talking about it. It's that internal comms. It's that internal marketing that you want to really support. And I really think an internal podcast can be a big factor in
yeah.
really, keeping your employees up to speed in a lot of different ways. So that's the one pitfall there is just really thinking about this as not a channel, but as really a whole conversation, and you're really opening up that line of communication between leadership or other people within your company.
Yeah, yeah, I'm there with that, and I think to add to in even in our own experience is, and it's the same with an external podcast as well, is that we spend so much time creating a great piece of content in this podcast, and we don't often spend the time to promote it. And I
Yeah.
think that's another, perhaps it's either an oversight or an assumption on the part of people who are producing podcasts, especially internal podcasts, because you think, well, they're employees and they're going to be interested, so they're going to see it and they're going to listen or they're going to watch. And that's not necessarily the case. I know we've found that sometimes they don't even know it exists.
Yeah.
Or if they know that it exists, they're again not aware of the value that it brings, or they see it and it's too long, and I don't really have time for this, and they keep putting it on the shelf and kind of letting it sit there and not really engaging and using the time to again treat your employees as you would a customer. We spend again a lot of time investing and promoting our brand or products and services in the same way you're going to have to promote all of the great things that you provide for your employees, including a podcast that keeps them informed, keeps them motivated, even inspires them. How are we using the time to promote it to them? I think is another another bit of advice I would add there, given our experience as well. Tristan, I guess just kind of coming down to the wire now, how would you say someone can tell that their podcast is working, right? Any metrics that we should be looking out for, or any kind of a temperature checks that we can do? What would you suggest are great ways to know whether our internal podcasts are having the impact that we want it to have?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I would answer it the same way that I would an external podcast. And it's really that combination of qualitative and quantitative feedback.
Mm,
And if you think about an internal podcast, one way you can certainly detect downloads. Depending on the platform, you can actually determine which subscriber or which person that enrolled, who's listening to what episode. So you get some detail there on the private side. You get a lot of the same metrics that you would an external podcast with these platforms. Like what device they're using, which episodes are being downloaded the most. So that's a key indicator just to see what is
okay.
actually interesting to your audience, to your internal employees. So there's that data piece. And then there's just the qualitative side too. It's trying to figure out all right, in that Slack channel, when you shared that video or that episode, what did people say afterward? Or what are you hearing? Does that episode and that information translate to the water cooler? Are you getting some of that information? And we
Yeah.
all know that information passes through companies like wildfire. So I
Yep.
think there's a way that you can gather some of that qualitative feedback that I think is almost the bigger piece to a podcast, because it is that intimate relationship that you have with the listener, and that one download, it's just one number. It's
Mhm.
one download, and it's one 20-minute episode, but what impact did that have?
Yeah.
Did that person on the other side really understand, why you're opening up a new location in a different region? Do they know why you're making sweeping changes to your user interface? And is that important to your customers? And, like, what's the why behind some of this? And that's really where you can't quantify some of that stuff. It's just a clarity piece, and getting everyone rowing in the same direction. And I'm curious, do you know anything about EOS, the Entrepreneurial Operating System, by any
Oh,
chance?
no, I don't.
So that's something that I became aware of about 10 years ago, and that's
Okay.
how I really build my companies. It's based on a book called Traction, but something in that book, and they basically provide a lot of different tools for entrepreneurs to build a foundation, and different pieces that start with the vision of your company, and it rolls down all the way to, like, your weekly to-dos, and sharing that information with employees. But the one thing I remember when I first started using EOS, is what it's called, is that your employees, your team, they have to hear something 6, 7, 8 times before it starts to click. So let's say you roll out these core values and this mission for your company. If you distribute that in a 5-minute video from your CEO, and you just put it out there on your internal portal and just leave it, I mean, people just aren't going to attach themselves to it.
Yeah.
You have to repeat it, and it's gotta become a core part of just consistent messaging.
Mm.
And that's just something that really, speaks to me, and I feel like that, with your internal podcast, you get the opportunity to, it's not really repeating yourself. It's more reinforcing those
Forcing.
messaging. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great. Great. Wow. Tristan, you shared so much today. And we're coming down now to this segment of my show where I talk about the final nugget. Well, it's not really, I don't talk about it. I actually pose the question of all my guests, of all the nuggets that you would have shared today. What, in your view, is the most important takeaway that you think our listeners should come away with today, having
The
listened to everything you would have shared?
yeah, the most important thing is podcasts are more than an audio channel. So just think about them in more along the lines of a conversation, and how conversations can work for you in your business. And we even like to think about a podcast is really creating a conversation flywheel. And that's what can create this flywheel internally with an internal podcast, and just educating, informing, and inspiring your employees. And then just think about how that would also translate to your customers, and the impact that it can have there. So that's what I would leave folks with, Kerry-Ann. Podcasts are more than an audio channel.
I'm with that. Podcast more than just an audio channel. So many possibilities, so many opportunities. And again, when we talk about internal marketing, when we talk about the need to really engage our employees in promoting our mission, our vision, purpose, product, services to them, the possibilities are endless of how a podcast can bring that to life in a real way, and it's awesome. Tristan, this has been such a great conversation. I'm so very grateful to you for your time and your generosity of sharing all of the great information and experiences you've built up over the years. And of course, I can't say goodbye without asking you, how can we, the internal marketing tribe, support you?
I think really two ways to get in touch. First is LinkedIn. Carrie Ann, that's how we
Yeah,
met and started our
that's right.
conversations. Good old LinkedIn. You can find me, Tristan Pelligrino. I think I'm the only one on there. And
Yeah.
then the
You
other
got
the
a
other way,
unique name there.
yeah, yeah, there aren't any others. And then the other one is just, I would encourage folks to check out Recorded Content. That's our show that we
Yeah.
we produce to help other marketers get the most out of podcasts. And I think that would play nicely with a lot of things we talked about here today, and how, it applies to podcasts in general, but then you can also roll those back to an internal podcast as well and learn some things there. So